So it's been a while since we sat down like this together, but I think over the last couple of months there have been more important things in the world which have taken precedence. On our return, we have an amazing conversation which I think is relevant now and will be for a long time.
If capitalism is so great, why doesn't it work for me?
Over the next decade or so, $100 trillion is going to transfer between the generations.
Normally, wealth flows from one generation to another when they die. This time around, wealth is flowing, and so is power.
We were lucky enough to be invited into the home of Ken Costa, who's recently written a book on this topic called The $100 Trillion Wealth Transfer.
Don't want to do any work, smashed avocados, the battery runs out of an iPhone.
If you haven't heard of Ken, he's kind of a big deal in the finance world. He was chairman of UBS and later Lazard International. Most recently, he sits as chairman of Helios Fairfax, which is the largest private equity group in all of Africa. Ken also advises world leaders, and he was the UK's envoy to Saudi Arabia under then Prime Minister Theresa May. He actually advised on the sale of Harrods to the Qatari royal family, and he's one of the greatest financiers of the last 20 years.
Millennials will be in controlling positions of every major corporation within the next 10 years.
Ken actually believes it could be the end of capitalism.
You actually believe that it could be the end of capitalism as we know it.
And that's because with the money that's transferring between the generations, so is a lot of power. And he sees our generation, with all of its caricatures, as having an entirely different agenda to his.
We had to work very hard, we had to struggle, it wasn't just given to us.
And what Ken actually believes is it's the collaboration between the generations that will secure the best future for all of us.
Co-destiny is the working together of the generations that will enable the next generation to know that there's somebody there who's co-investing with them, co-working with them.
This was an amazing conversation. Ken was a charming man. He did give us actually a lot of hope looking ahead into the future. I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome back to season 2 of Loose Change.
Ken, thank you so much for inviting us to your home.
No, it's very nice to have you here.
Yeah, no, it's lovely. I feel very comfortable already.
Very good, very good.
So we're here today to talk about your new book, The $100 Trillion Wealth Transfer. A riveting read.
Well, it's kind of you to say it. You've already sort of thumbed through the book, so
yeah.
That's amazing.
It was an easy read. It was an easy read, and I think it's on such an important topic, particularly for me. Not least because I've established a whole brand around the subject, and so I did feel quite listened to in your book. But to get into it in brief, over the next couple of decades, we're set to see $100 trillion by conservative estimates of wealth be passed between generations, from your generation to mine, from boomers to the Zennials. So I thought it was particularly appropriate.
Well, we're not going to ask you whether you're a Gen Z or a millennial or somewhere in between.
What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't want to guess, but I will say Gen Z.
You're too kind. You're too kind. But it suggests that we're moving into what you've described as an inheritocracy.
Yes.
And but more crucially, I think you've described this time as an opportunity to either shape or break the new economy, or shape and break capitalism and the market economy.
Sure.
Now, that's a real strong take to have as well. But I guess it emphasizes just how crucial this change will be, not least because of the huge chasm in attitudes between your generation and mine. But what makes you say that it's going to be such a crucial shape or break moment when this wealth is transferred?
Well, there's several reasons, and again, thank you for being, ahead of the game, because this is a very hot topic, and it's going to get hotter. It's not going away. So there are several reasons why it is so. Firstly, the quantum of money.
Yeah.
There is an enormous amount that is flowing, and people say, "Oh well, everybody, one generation dies, another generation takes over." No, this time round, because of the asset inflation of the last 15 years, a generation has got so much more capital than it's ever had in absolute terms and in relative terms. And this is already beginning to flow in the UK.
Yeah.
The Bank of Mum and Dad is already putting down the deposits for the next generation, £68 billion. It's the biggest bank to provide equity for the next generation. But it's not only the flow of money. the most important part of it is that the technology is there to empower the generation. So it's real empowerment. Normally, wealth flows from one generation to another when they die. This time around, wealth is flowing, and so is power. And the power is in technology. The power is in influence through social media.
Yeah.
And thirdly, there is an empowerment because of a generation that is very clear what its agenda is. And taken together, you've got a big flow of wealth, influence, and power.
That's so interesting. And I actually want to start by reading you something that I wrote, which is, it's so relevant to
That'll be
everything.
good to hear.
It's so relevant to everything that you've just said. And I wrote it just over 3.5 years ago. And I sort of went back to reread an excerpt of this article. And I wrote it when we were founding Millennial Money, which is the brand, the community that we've built of Zennials around the theme of money, finance, and also just our generationally unique experience of being quote unquote young people. So I wrote, we came of age during a global financial crisis through political austerity and inherited an inflated housing market. It's safe to say we haven't been equipped to succeed in these conditions. Now, in the wake of an unprecedented global pandemic that is bringing society as we know it to its knees, there's much uncertainty as we navigate this uncharted territory. One thing we know for sure is that this crisis will pass, and whatever the conditions we inherit thereafter, money will still be as prevalent an issue as it was before. Each generation has its own troubles to negotiate, and it may seem that millennials are negotiating the lion's share of difficult global events. We are a self-empowered, tech-enabled, collaborative, health and climate-conscious generation, defining our own markers for adulthood. Now,
Well, I couldn't have put it better. So you should have been the author, as you were when you wrote it. And you're absolutely right. Except it's much worse.
Yeah.
Because with the pandemic came this vast borrowings that central governments globally have taken on. And the debts have to be repaid. The fact about debt, it doesn't go away.
Yeah.
It has to be repaid. So full marks for being prescient.
I'm glad.
Even a bit gloomy.
I'm glad you think so. But I think that probably sums up a lot of the feeling of our generation. And we do have our grievances. And I know there is caricatures of mudslinging between your generation and mine.
And vice versa.
And vice versa. And I think part and parcel of that is because we feel quite hard done by, with 2 once-in-a-lifetime financial crises having to be negotiated by our generation. And then we feel like perhaps your generation, you benefited from really positive inflationary environments.
Sure.
And I guess that really adds to the whole feeling of, we have all of these grievances, we weren't set up to succeed. Can you appreciate why my generation, and it does go throughout your book, you do seem to acknowledge a lot of our grievances, but can you appreciate why this generation does feel so aggrieved?
Absolutely. And it's one of the reasons that I've written that, because I'm not one of those who looks at the generation and just sort of thinks, don't want to do any work, smashed avocados on toast, and the major crisis occurs, the battery runs out of an iPhone. I don't have that view. My view is that this is a generation that is in many ways got enormous foresight. It's prophetic. It's looking forward. And I've coached and mentored and invested and worked together with a wide range of this generation. Indeed, when I was first, about a few years ago, we were setting up an investment bank in London. We said we wanted to be the Millennium, the bank for the millennials. Well, my colleagues laughed at me and said, well, you can't do this because they're feckless and they never want to invest. But actually that is changing because there is a new seriousness with which we need to work on the generational divides. Yes, you're so right. There have been silos that have been created in which one generation has contained itself and another generation has just been looking around and saying, well, what have you guys done? You've got the fat of the land, and now you want to make us capitalists. You want to be effectively wanting to turn us into capitalists, but we don't have any capital because you had the fat of the land. So yes, I understand it, and I think there is an answer to it.
Yeah, and you touched on that point. I think you quite aptly described in your book that a generation without capital can never be capitalist. So I couldn't put that better myself. But how do we remedy that? Aside from the fact that my generation is in line to inherit this immense amount of wealth, you actually believe that unless that's handled properly, it could be the end of capitalism as we know it.
Well, I do, because if the divisions that are now so evident everywhere we're looking in our society, we've got major, a fragmented and fractured, not only society, but generations. And if we don't address these intentionally, we're going to find that a generation will simply turn round and look to a previous one and say, you had the fat of the land, don't blame us.
Yeah.
And the consequence of that, in my view, is very dangerous. And it's dangerous because the view would be, well, we have to have bigger governments, expecting government to solve things on the one hand, and at the same time, we will lose that essential part of the what I call the socially energized capital system, which is that you reward risk, you reward endeavor, you reward people who've taken the opportunities to create wealth in society,
Yeah.
rather than just trying to distribute it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on earlier, and it seems like you're taking a different stance, is that many of your generation, they're quite reluctant to pass the baton on to younger generations, like mine, because there is a view that we might squander it or waste it. Again, many of those caricatures, but also there's a view that my generation doesn't really care to upkeep the baton that is being passed now, because they don't believe it works anyway.
But it's not so much the squandering, is that there is a view that it's so idealistic on environment, on climate change, on justice, on quality, as to be able to say, I want to have an agenda that drives ahead of economic productivity. That is the piece where we have to be working together.
Yeah.
And the way I think I put it in the book is that we need the hindsight of my generation, the insight of yours, to create foresight, i.e. what's going to happen next in the economy, and to create that purposeful working together in economic terms. And I think that is, of course, the great challenge.
I understand that, and I think I see that as a rallying cry throughout your book, and I genuinely do buy into it by the end of the book, certainly.
I won't ask you by when it was.
Because I've recognized, even in the 3 years since I wrote that article, I've noticed with my own hindsight how much things have changed, and I've also noticed small mistakes that I couldn't have foreseen. So I think it's easy for my generation to assume that we can't lean into the hindsight or wisdom of yours, but I recognize the value of it. And equally, like you mentioned, the insights of ours, because we understand our experiences perhaps better than the economic and social conditions that you had.
But also, is a very important piece you've raised there. The fact is that your generation isn't fearful of technology.
Yeah.
So when we're having the debate on ChatGPT or artificial intelligence, quantum, whatever it is, there is a certain fearfulness that technology is going to be so descriptive of everything that we're going to have in our lives that it needs to be reined in, controlled. Now, there is a measure of that, but it has to come from a view of a constructive use of that, rather than a fear that it is going to suddenly nobody's going to have any jobs or any of those sort of fearful things, which I don't think is going to happen. Still think that there'll be great productivity, as every change in technology has produced. Productivity will, in proper hands, enable it, us to really grow significantly into the future. So I think that the generation is poised to have a two-way street. We have to learn as well from the insights. People often think that hindsight is, and yes, it's true, we've been through recessions, we've been through inflation, and periods like that, which your generation hasn't yet. But that is not the only way. It is a two-way street. The insight, i.e. the looking forward. Let me give you a small example. I would be brought up in any time by a manager saying, I want feedback. Give us some feedback. Now, your generation looking around saying, do you know what? I'll give you feed forward. I enable you to look forward, to look at what the world will look like. And then, you assess me as to my contribution into what a changing world would look like, rather than what I got right or wrong by looking back.
Yeah, absolutely. I do see great value in that wisdom and insight as well. I do want to ask you though, and you mentioned
Sure.
an anecdote of an experience that you had with someone. I think it was during the protests after 2008 in front of St. Paul's, and I think it was a gentleman that said to you, "If capitalism is so great, why doesn't it work for me?" And that really struck me actually. And how would you go about now answering that question to a generation? I guess that gentleman spoke for a generation that felt somewhat betrayed.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right, and I see it as vividly as if it were now. They were all camped outside St. Paul's Cathedral, and the cathedral had to close, and it was a fear at the time that there would be violence, and therefore, and I was asked to mediate, which is why I was there in the first place, between the city fathers and the people camped out there. And it deeply struck me as to say to that if we are going to have the market economy being able to be free and working to the best advantage of all people, then it has to be able to answer those deep questions that he was asking. A lot has changed since then. I think that there has been a greater recognition that you can't separate out pure financial returns from its ethical moorings. Mm-hmm. There are questions of right and wrong. We're increasingly, and will need to more so, understand that the ethics of capitalism is both caught and taught.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons we have to grapple with working from home, because you need to be in an environment where you can actually see how people behave in order to govern your own behavior. Yeah. So I think that behavioral change is one of the key things that has changed, particularly with a new generation coming up. Because don't forget, millennials will be in controlling positions of every major corporation within the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And therefore they will see this change and want to implement it.
Absolutely. And we're seeing a lot of that already. There's part of me that sometimes when I'm sat with my friends in a casual setting, and we're sort of reaching the early levels of management in our careers, and there is a moment of, how did we get here already? This is sort of come about so fast. I wonder if you've ever experienced that in your very.
No, because we had to work very hard. we had to struggle. It wasn't just given to us. We didn't have technology that could do things more rapidly. Yeah, of course. I mean, every generation looks at it, but the speed of technological change, and therefore those that are best able to utilize the technological change, has made this big difference.
Yeah.
Which is why the empowered generation, we come back to it, wealth and power is moving, and that's what's of course going to be significant. You just think of what a storm you could start on one social media activity, which every major corporation would have to take. Now, we used to think of shareholders' meetings, where you'd all get together at the annual general meeting of Shell or BP or one of those. Well, you don't wait a year. You could see that within an instant. The shareholders are lobbied by consumers. Yeah. Exxon found that when they had to give their board members changed because of a social media pressure. Yeah. And that will continue in the hands of the next generation. So that's both exciting, but it's also, we have to be careful that it doesn't destroy the very activity that we're trying to preserve.
So the world of finance and making money, investing, has become democratized. I think that's how we describe it, and that actually underpins our brand. So in Millennial Money, what we talk about is the democratization of money and finance, and we invite people to contribute to that conversation that might otherwise have not been able to. What's your take on this widespread democratization of finance?
Well, the good side of it is that it's spreading.
Yeah.
in that people feel a greater vested interest in, what kind of investments they have, where they're invested.
Yeah.
The other side of it is that it's the dangerous piece of cryptocurrency, which of course I think is going to be here to stay. I don't think it's disappeared.
Yeah.
But it was partly a protest movement by a generation that said, we don't trust the fiat currencies of the world.
Yeah.
We want to have a currency that is outside of the authority structures.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think that's a necessarily very good idea, but it is challenging that very structure, which I think is important. And then there are other dangers. Give you an example. And recently, the Financial Conduct Authority had to say, look, we are a bit worried about the gamification of investment.
Yeah.
You can buy 1/100th of an Amazon share,
Yeah.
and hey, your share's gone up by 5 points. Do you want to buy more?
Yeah.
Or you get some points for going up or going down. So it becomes a game. And I think we need to be very careful, because investment in its very nature, particularly equity investment, is a long-term strategy.
Absolutely.
And therefore democratization, yes, but financial democracy over a period of time.
Yeah, I entirely agree, and who am I to disagree with you on the topic of finance? But
Yes, you can disagree with me on all things, but it's good to know that we're on the same page on this.
in terms of having a long-term vision and long-term outlooks, I can share a funny story with you.
Tell me.
On what you just said. So we actually set up an investment club 3 years ago between friends. It's to encourage some of our friends that may have been fearful of the concept of investing, and some of us have been investing for a few years. We came together to do equity investing, and this was in 2020, just before the big tech boom of 20. I think it was the bull market of 2021.
Yeah.
So we were all stock picking. And within about 6 or 7 months, we're like, this is so easy. This is a mugs game.
Yeah.
Where all of our stocks were up on average 50-60%. And of course, within 6 months, our entire portfolio had been struck down with what happened thereafter. But there was in that microcosm, a moment of, this is so easy, anyone can do it, because all we'd experienced as part of this investment club.
But the interesting thing is that if you'd had a boomer there, you might have just had somebody who said, you know what, I was through the tech boom. I saw it. The trees don't go to the skies. Hey, take a bit of profit here and get, take some of the paper, turn it into real money, put a deposit on your house.
Yeah.
And that's what I think, why I think it's important, generationally, to be able to use, the expertise of one generation and the innovative, creative capacity. I talk about socially energized capitalism, and then the operative word is energized. I mean, your generation has got amazing energy.
Yeah.
And it's not only energized; it's creative energy, wanting to find new ways of discovering, more effective ways of being productive, etc. But it's socially, you want to share it with others. There's a certain social awareness. And I think that's wonderful, but it is still capitalism.
Yeah.
It is still that you have to reward risk, you have to reward returns on that risk, you have to assess those risks, and reward endeavor, and that, I think, is the piece that I most worry about.
Yeah.
That if we don't engage in that, actively engage in that debate, then I think we will get lost.
Absolutely. I think there is a real need to lean into wisdom, and I'm sort of using your own words there, because I think you mentioned that wisdom is the key to achieving the success, and you likened and used the term wisdom specifically as opposed to knowledge, because knowledge in the 21st century is everywhere. You can just Google it, but you can't Google wisdom, as you mentioned as well, and that's something that you need to lean into, and the only way my generation can get that wisdom is by collaborating with yours.
There is the key word, collaborating, because when you look through the basic structure of what I've been thinking about, which is there is a generational move of capital and wealth and power. There are divisions, big fissures that exist between the two generations. How then do you solve them? How do you work together on it? And you know, we've seen which is the word I use. We've seen co-investing, co-working. They've been part of part of your life and part of mine, as we've seen this in the last few years. What we haven't seen is the philosophical change that occurs with what I call co-destiny. In other words, where we know that we have to collaborate together, we want to be compassionate but together. And co-destiny is the working together of the generations that will enable the next generation to know that there's somebody there who's co-investing with them, co-working with them, cooperating with them. And I'm very struck, many startups occur because you find somebody with two different skill sets. They became co-founders, almost all over, where one is geekish and the other is maybe financially a little more oriented. And I think that working together of the skill sets is an example of what co-destiny could look like, i.e. we working together to create that future for the generations.
Absolutely, and I think that's a running theme throughout your book, the idea of which manifests in so many different ways. And actually, on like I have a co-founder as well, and and we lean into different skill sets. And actually, a lot of the VC talk now is about finding a co-founder, because if you're able to find a co-founder, you've managed to sell your idea to someone and convince them initially as well. The concept of collaboration, as you said, runs throughout most of the things that we do, and sharing and collaborating in some way. But it needs to come into fruition, I guess, intergenerationally as well.
Well, your generation, sharing, caring, staring, is...
Where does the staring come in?
Well, the screens, right, and the screens, not anything else. Sharing, caring, and staring, I think, is a caricature, but there is that element in that you do want to share, perhaps more than my generation. Because if you think, you're perhaps driven by circumstances, you're much more prepared to be asset light, to be renting what you need to use. You would not necessarily want to buy a car if you know that you could use one whenever you needed it, or to pay insurance on a car throughout the whole year when all you wanted to do is to have short trips and pay the insurance on it, or Airbnb, or much greater sense of happy not to have that proprietary desire that everything you have must be owned by you, a greater willingness to see that sharing, and I think that's very healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think throughout the book as well, there's an encouragement from you to your generation to lean into collaboration with mine as well. And in particular, I wanted to touch into the co-investing side, because your generation, having a lot more capital than mine, have the means to invest in us. But one of the things that you mentioned, and I agree with that concept entirely, is that investing in the Xennial generation is as good an act of charity as donating to an NGO. Now, I appreciate the concept, but I have to challenge that slightly, because I think what my generation has probably proven already is that we're more than a charity case, in that a lot of the hugely successful companies were actually already founded by Xennials, so we can be hugely profitable to invest in as well.
I think that I would agree with you. I mean, the point I was trying to make there, badly as it now appears, was that actually, if you're investing into a startup with somebody, and that startup goes on, because of the agenda that generation has, actually they will want to create wealth, they want to create value, and are much more generous in helping others, in helping other startups, in sharing their technology, sharing their know-how. I'm deeply struck, by the way, in which founders are prepared to talk to others. They're less proprietary about, the mistakes they've made, open about their mistakes, helping new startups, watch out for this, that incubator, or, or whatever. So I think that it is a good investment.
You're so right, and I'm so happy you perfectly set me up there, because that collaboration between founders in my generation really does exist, and within the founder community, that's definitely a hallmark. And I've made some really great friends within the founder community. One of the founders, actually a co-founder that you mentioned in your book, is a friend of mine. His name's Harjas Singh. He co-founded Shares.
Oh, right.
The platform.
Oh, right.
Mentioned,
yeah. Good.
So, and then another friend of mine, Roy Samuels, he's onto his second startup now as well. And we regularly message and text each other, again, giving advice on what's working, what's not. And there isn't that sense of individual, I must win at all costs, and if I help someone else, there is a feeling, despite everything that we know, that more people can win. And
well, it is this, the move is from I do me to we do us.
Yeah.
And I think this we do us is the essential philosophical concept that I think has already changed, and that it is happening, and people still think, well, it's a very sort of narcissistic generation that wants to just shag, shop and share. I don't go with that.
Yeah.
I think that there is, just as you've described, there is, and of course it's always difficult when you're making generalizations. There's always an exception to it. But if you look at the trend of it, I think the trend of it is that there is a deep-seated sense of, I don't lose anything by sharing. In fact, that which I gain is far greater than that which I lose by being able to work together with others and to cooperate with them and found new businesses together. It's very exciting.
So I think everything that we've discussed so far is all very hopeful and all within this hopeful tone, partly because I'm speaking to you and you're championing this intergenerational collaboration. It isn't always that pleasant. Because I don't think everyone harbours such positive feelings between the generations. There's a feeling in my generation, I think, that boomers in your generation perhaps weren't the best stewards of the world that we've inherited.
True.
And for many, many reasons, I feel like there is a lot of distrust between the generations. And we've seen that more and more reasons perhaps to feel, I don't use the term betrayed too lightly, and I mean generationally betrayed in a number of settings. And I think there's a real requirement now and an imperative to rebuild that trust. And you mentioned that's important for Co as well.
Well, it's very important. I mean, I think in particular, your generation grew up in the shadow of the global financial crisis. And the global financial crisis had many features to it, but one of them that was essential to it was the breakdown of trust.
Yeah.
Because at that moment, a generation said, well, if you can't trust the banks, who can we trust? They saw what the banks did to their parents, to their family. And so the generational distrust for anything corporate or institutional has been very seriously undermining, whether it's politics or the health service or the army or whatever it might be. There is a sense that there is a betrayal there, and particularly that the capitalist system is just favoring one group of people. Now, the sheer economic facts are that is what happened. But we need to rebuild trust. And trust is built, in the financial world, it's built trade by trade. You've got to start with the simplest and smallest moves to begin to build the trust. And so what is the trust that needs to be built? The trust that needs to be built is that one generation will at least look to the next and say, this is not a whole bunch of entitled people, but actually respect the views that they have. So, for example, if a company has a mission statement, well, every company has a mission statement, you have pages and pages of annual reports. Well, how many young people have been involved in the compilation of that? And more particularly, if you want to really build trust, then have people accountable to a generation. Why a generation? Well, because they're the ones that are most disadvantaged and the ones that have to live in the world that is, to put your words, we haven't precisely looked after the things that you were that interested in, to monitor the way in which a mission statement of a corporation might work. Not only do you say it, but how are you living it? And if not, then this is the point that makes the difference. how can we constructively work together to set clear, definable goals and measure against them what has been achieved. And so I think that that's how the trust begins to build. But it's built up from the ground up.
Yeah, I can see that. And to make this more relevant to me, let's say, and I can give you another anecdote. I've given you a few. So I just turned 30 this year.
Wow.
Wow. I may not look it. I just turned 30 this year. So I finished high school. I finished my A-levels in 2012. That's when I started university, and graduated in 2015. So almost 10 years ago. Now, I was the first year that had the increase in tuition fees. So we feel particularly aggrieved. And we remember at the time that the Nick Clegg and David Cameron coalition government, that we feel sold us down the river with the increase in tuition fees. And there's a lot of economic scarring that we're actually experiencing, not only from the global financial crisis, but through policies like the increase in tuition fees, which has been increased again now for younger generations. And actually now, almost 10 years into our careers, we can see the direct impact on our bottom line. And I think for fun last night, I messaged all of my friends and we looked at our student loans and what was outstanding.
Oh dear, this is clearly going to be a difficult one.
Yeah, so
go on.
So having worked almost a decade with, and I consider us a privileged group. So we, with all of us working in quite high paying jobs across investment banking, law, consulting, we have dentists in our group as well. And I think most people hadn't even felt like they'd made a dent into that student loan, partly because I think the interest rates were retrospectively hiked. I think now they sit at about 7.3%, and there is a feeling that even in these high-paying jobs, most people probably won't pay these student loans off, and it's become somewhat of a graduate tax. Now that's one example, which then was compounded on through policies and feeling unrepresented by leadership. That I think has meant generationally we don't really feel like we can trust leaders or a generation before us that had.
That is true, of course.
It'd
be very interesting to see what your generation does to balance the books.
Yeah.
Because every one of these is a trade-off. It's a trade-off in whether you're going to have your student loans, and I understand that. Probably because we didn't have them, and But when you've now got a public sector that is healthcare, and now with 2 wars going on, and who knows whether there'll be any more. Defense spending, which is very difficult. Where is the balance struck?
Yeah.
Now, the problem that you raise, of course, is that it was a generational inequality. It wasn't that, this was a cutting of the state, which was borrowing too much, etc., and had to solve this issue. It was that over the period of time, this intergenerational inequity was what makes this so painful. And I really do understand that. How that is addressed for the next generation is, I think, now immensely more complicated because of COVID. I mean, the very substantial borrowings that have come back to it, that a more productive society means that there's a greater ability to deal with those issues if we're producing more, and therefore taxation becomes, well, there is a point at which taxation becomes a lack of incentive to do anything, or for people to go to university because the costs are so high.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're seeing more of a move now where people are recognizing that there may be benefits of them not going to university and starting their careers sooner. And there is a real calculation now, whereas previously, certainly when I was going to university, it was the obvious choice. You went to uni to land better jobs and better careers. And now there's definitely a question mark over that concept. You said, and I really liked how you phrased this, that relationships between generations will always develop at the speed of trust. And coming from a generation that is generally so deeply disillusioned by the politicians that represent us, and perhaps feeling let down by a previous generation, how do you advise a generation like that trust can be repaired? Like, what are the steps that need to be taken to rebuild that trust?
I think coming back to my trust is built trade by trade. It is built at the ground level. It is built in the startup by both, and I think the initiative is with us to be able to see young entrepreneurs and to become alongside them and to show, you've got to have skin in your game. You've got to like what you're doing, and you've got to believe in the product that you're creating. But if we're able to begin to do that and to encourage that generational investment, I think you're starting at the bottom. You start with, the skeptical first kick off, and then over a period of time, it looks as if, I can benefit from this. I can see that your wisdom and your capital has enabled me to, to move to the next step. And so you begin to build the levels of trust. So that, I think, is at the base levels in startups.
Yeah.
It's much more difficult in the corporate world, where I think you have to do it almost by generation.
Yeah.
Being prepared to consult, to consider different views, to take seriously the comments of a generation that is much more prospective than previous ones might have been, rather than merely sort of looking back. So I think that is there, built by accepting that the generation is different, but it is nonetheless very important in its contribution to the future strategy, to the future prospects of a company.
Yeah, I get that. Absolutely. And I think there is a long way to go in rebuilding that trust. But like you say, I think trade by trade, policy by policy.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid there's no macro picture that would change it. I mean, because the entire system depends on trust. And when you're breaking trust, which of course what happened in the global financial crisis, is the trust between the depositors and the institutions as the banks were collapsing, that broke at its most fundamental level.
Yeah, and I'm very much a child of that global financial crisis. So I
I think it was your word, which I think is a very good word. There was the financial scarring that your generation felt, and I think we have to carry that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the fear as a result of all of this is, perhaps rightly or wrongly, that you see that there is a risk of my generation being a lot more socialist than previous generations, and you actually really do warn against some of that and caution against a lot of those sentiments, because we haven't seen capitalism work for us in the same way. There is a leaning into something else that we haven't entirely experienced, and we're idealizing. But why is it that you warn against that leaning so heavily?
Well, because for the simple reason that people have said, capitalism. Young people said to me, capitalism is broke. Why do you want to fix it? And the answer is, I still think that it recognizes much more than anything else the importance of reward for initiative, for work, for creativity, for taking risk. And so I caution against it, but I'm trying to build the two together. Socially energized capitalism is what I'm trying to work out, is that there is, if we can work together between the generations to recognize that there is a community responsibility, there is a collaborative desire to work together, but not at the expense of not being able to be more productive and more value added in the way in which the economy works. And it's a fundamental view that I have, that a socialist desire to cut the cake is not it doesn't work if you don't grow the cake.
I understand that, and I actually really liked how, away from just the financial elements, all of this is really going to impact the fabric of society as a whole.
Yes.
Politically, socially, financially, of course.
Yes.
I liked how you deconstructed the concept of radical individualism, which maybe your generation was more likened for, and all of the ills that it might bring, but also presenting caution to collectivism as the antidote, because the individual when it's collectivism, the individual is actually someone that becomes quite incidental and subordinate to the whims of the greater collective. And you're kind of pulled by abstract motivations. And it's much more important to find a balance in between those, to have like a collective goal, but also be individually appreciated. Now, I wonder, and this is just to get your opinion on this, do you think like a spiritual calculus improves that?
Well, I do, as it happens. I think there is an extraordinary desire in the generation for a spirituality that was absent from mine. There is a recognition that not everything can be reduced to a financial calculus.
Yeah.
That there is a dimension beyond the material.
Yeah.
That happiness, enjoyment of life, fulfillment in life can't simply come in terms of materialist or financial reward.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, an integral part of the way in which we need to work together. The level of mental issues that is growing in this generation is frightening.
Yeah.
I mean, it is exponential.
Yeah.
And so we have to recognize that with the absence of limits, of borders, of the always-on generation, you can't switch it off. The machine is always with you. There comes with it an attack on the fundamental humanity of the individual. And so we need to remember that we can't continue to assume that we can just continue to perform as individuals 24/7, as if we were the machines in our pockets, which are on 24/7.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So from my perspective, we experience things like the global financial crisis as children of the global financial crisis, and then all that endured afterwards. From your side, you were at the very pinnacle of a career in finance. You've been chairman of UBS and then Lazard, and these institutions are huge, global institutions, and you witnessed from the very highest leadership position how to navigate these. I describe choppy waters as a
tsunami, I think.
Yeah. What was that experience like?
Well, it was frightening. I mean, it was absolutely frightening. I mean, you do have to realize that, the crisis that occurred was so rapid when one of our major banks was going to go down, that day. And if that had happened, I mean, every ATM in the country would have stopped if the government hadn't bailed them out. So the government did exactly the right thing, was to bail out the banking system. There was no other way to do it. But the fact is, indeed, I'd been worrying about it ever since that earlier experience on St. Paul's Cathedral, that we'd lost the moral moorings. And when you lose sight of that, then there's nothing that can control it, because banks create credit. Credit it's extraordinary. The regulators say you've got to have a certain amount of capital and then you can lend against it. But banks created it. Yeah. But what they didn't do is they weren't responsible for what they had created. And so we saw this fundamental break in the capitalist system. And being part of it was frightening at the time, because I suppose we realized what the consequence was, that if every ATM stopped and there's no money in the system. Yeah. So those were frightening moments, it has to be said.
No, I can imagine. And in that time, I sort of like take myself back, and the discourse that's followed is, again, the intergenerational mudslinging, but bankers being characterized as these characters who are greedy, selfish. You very much were the top of the banking game. You were said banker that people were describing. And actually, in reading about you and knowing you, there's a real dissonance, actually, when I understand your character, because in one instance, you were the man. You were the caricature of the man at the very top of the banking game as a financier. But you've also, in your personal life, had a background of activism, which it doesn't match that narrative. You were a part of the anti-apartheid activist movement as a student, and I'd love to know more about that, because in your native South Africa at the time as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's always more difficult because, yes, we were,
Yeah.
but to be perfectly honest, we didn't have to pay the real price that the people, the black people in the country had to pay, because we were privileged.
Yeah.
And some of them paid with their lives. Steve Biko, who I regard as being, you might have seen Cry Freedom, the film, who I regard as one of the great leaders of our time. South Africa would never have been in this mess if he was still around, because he would have been the natural successor to Mandela. So I've always had that sense of realizing the injustice of it was tangible at the time. But we had a tiny bit part. We tried as best we could. And so I've naturally always held this view that, one has to look at the underlying causes, that, where there is injustice, to try and deal with it.
Yeah.
And try to understand how people who are at the receiving end, the marginalized, the deprived, how they would react to many of the situations that they have to face. So it's kind of stayed with me, what it's like when you're a student.
Yeah.
You retain many of the things that you learn there, that you see there, you retain throughout your life.
And do you remember at that time your position opposing apartheid? And was that a controversial stance to take?
Well, it certainly didn't please my parents or the other people. We were part of a university which dedicated itself to the establishment of freedom.
Yeah.
For anybody of whatever race, color, religion, whatever it was. But it was barred. There were only white people in the university.
Yeah.
Were allowed to go to the university. So it was a terrible thing and Nelson Mandela, who I subsequently, got, met on several occasions, the great hero, was in jail. So there was no sense that there was any hope left.
Yeah.
And of course, you had one group of people that was controlling all the finance of it, and another racially divided group that was suffering as a result of the control that finance. So you realize the importance of what money does when it's in the hands of people who control it for the wrong ends.
Yeah.
Which is why I suppose I'm interested in the way in which, how is wealth and power distributed in a society. And that was a terrible example, and I did like remembering those days.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. You mentioned as well that you were part of the BLM protests when they happened. You joined on, and this was obviously at a time in your life that you were.
I did.
When it
was 50 years afterwards. I mean, it was a few years ago.
Yeah.
Again, because I think racism is a terrible thing. And of course, it's a destructive of the very nature of capitalism that we want to have, where people are treated for their worth, for their contribution, rather than because they are some identifiable race group. So, yeah.
And the reason I sort of bring that up is because I feel like my generation, there are mistakes in this. There is a conflation, the same way people may have conflated you as being the elite banker, and really taken away a lot of the underpinning values that you have as an individual person as well. And I think there is a conflating generally with capitalism that has facilitated a lot of the evils that we see.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily linked directly, but I think that perhaps we need to challenge a lot of the conflation with the capitalism we've experienced and a lot of the ills that it brings to society.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. The way I describe that is you become part. It becomes tribal, and everybody has to have a tribe. But the problem about the tribe is it's like my television subscription. They offer you a whole package of things. Well, actually, I don't want the cookery courses and the other things that are there. What I want is something else, but they give it to you in a package. So you either have to buy the whole package, or you can't get it. And so exactly the same thing happens. People buy into, if you're a capitalist, you have to agree to the following things, and if you're not. And I think one of the things that we need to break down is the siloing, this tribal cohorts that that are at each other, where everybody is presumed to have exactly the same ticking of the box.
Yeah.
That if you're a capitalist, you're not concerned for those that are marginalized.
Yeah.
And on you go. But I think that is one of the real issues that the generations are facing now, is that we should not be buying in to a whole package, but be much more discriminating and prepared to be different in seeing that which is value driven, but also values driven.
Yeah, I really, really do agree with that. And I think there's another concept which you talk about, which is it's important to have the ability to disagree well and respectfully as well.
Well, I chaired the Archbishop of Canterbury as the head of the Anglican Church. I chaired his trust, which was looking at ways in which one could write down for ordinary people to use a simple course of how do we disagree well. And I think it's really important. If we're ever going to break through these silos that have been established, rather than slinging mud either way between one generation and the other, it will be, how do we disagree well and feel good about it? Being, that it's part of human, it's how we test each other, but we do it graciously. We do it in a civilized way. And of course, Twitter rages that don't help, because you can rage for just throwing something out there.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that strikes me is I think challenging the status quo is always going to be controversial in some way at any point.
Well, it's more difficult if you're invested in the status quo. I think of myself in South Africa. We were challenging the status quo because it was relatively easy, because we were students.
Yeah.
There was no, except that a number of them paid with their lives and a number were locked up, so there was a consequence there. But by and large, if you're part of the sort of, you want to preserve the status quo.
Yeah.
And what we need to encourage each other is to look to see what is good. What can we build together? How can we cooperate and create a co-destiny that works together for the betterment not only of the financial system but of our society and of humanity as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's particularly poignant now in the workplace with a lot of the geopolitical tensions in the world. We've found it. Almost like there is a fear, people who are sort of working and like you said, maybe invested in the status quo, or feel like they have competing concerns to challenge any ideal or have a different view. But like I said, when we look to the past with hindsight, those that actually had different ideals and stood for them, we can look back now and say that they were amazing heroic efforts that we reap the benefits for.
Well, that's always going to be the case when one is able to look back and to see those who really made the difference, both intellectually but also by their lives. Because it's one thing to have a set of views, it's another to underwrite them with the way in which you live.
Yeah,
and that's what makes the difference.
Yes, absolutely. No, I love that. And you mentioned Nelson Mandela, who you met a couple of times.
I did.
Who is a great hero of our time. Yeah. And he was a hero of yours, you mentioned.
Oh, of course.
What do you think his take would be on the state of affairs in the world now, which seems so fractured with?
Well, do you know? Funny you should ask me that question, because I remember meeting him, and when you meet somebody who's really amazing. And you sort of lost, he's such an icon. I was lost for words. I didn't know what to say. And I said to him, Madiba, which was his cousin name, what advice would you give to I think I said a young man. I mean, I honestly, how, the words, I wasn't young at the time, but probably in my 60s, were sort of muddled up. And he said to me, Ken, and I remember it, but he had that amazing lilt in his voice. I remember him saying to me, he said, Ken, it is very easy to make for disagreement, but you must make for peace. That is difficult. And I just thought to myself, he was absolutely right. So I'm sure where he would be looking, he would be working, saying, how was it possible that you could work together? Would be the first thing I would hope he would say, looking to what he did in South Africa, where he had to work together with the co-destiny of the leaders of the white tribe and the black tribe coming together to see co-destiny working for the betterment of the whole of that society.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really hits home, particularly today as we speak, where there's conflict in Ukraine and Russia and
Sure.
Palestine and Israel.
Sure.
And those words really like ring heavy. There's a word which you mentioned, a Zulu word, Ubuntu. I don't know if I pronounced that right.
You did.
Which loosely translates to "I am because you are."
Yes.
And I think that's an amazing segue vehicle to move forwards with, and thinking about how we can really make use of this opportunity, as you said at the start, to shape the future of capitalism, and for my generation, really shape our future. And the way you describe that repeatedly is to make use of your hindsight and our insights to create good foresight into the future. How do I do that?
You did that very well. Definitely, you'll get a prize for it.
but it's true. I think to foster that foresight is the best way, in your view, to build the future world. What is it that for you, the idea of this co-destiny that you described before, how can that be characterized?
Well, it's characterized for me by an extraordinary interest that I have and continued for many years in the next generation, both coaching, mentoring, rebuking at times, and investing with them. But that is all in one section.
Yeah.
When that goes to the financial, the creative. But there is a dimension which we have to accept is an important part of being a full human, because you're not fully human if the only part of your life is that which is satisfied by some materialist pleasure. And so for me, it is the integration, the drawing together of the emotions, of the spiritual, of the financial, to make the rounded human who could live in a very, very testing, hard time. Macro politics, you cannot turn on, we want to turn off our radios and our television because it is so awful, but we have to live within this world. How then do we live now? And the way we need to live now is that we need to learn to recognize our full humanity, which I think has been stripped back. And that's where a generation, prophetic as I would call it, can help a previous generation. And working together, that's what I really want to do, to train and equip the next generation of leaders. Yeah.
And I think that's so important to get right, as you mentioned repeatedly.
Well, to try to.
Yeah. In many senses, this incredible amount of wealth that's passing between generations, as you touched on earlier, has already started in a softer sense.
Sure.
The Bank of Mum and Dad you mentioned.
Sure.
A lot of the wealth is passing whilst the parents are still alive, or that the generation is still alive. It's not just that this generation will die, then we'll start again and start afresh. But there is an opportunity then, now, as the early parts of that wealth transfer has started, to begin to influence the best ways for that to take place. There are also a lot of dangers in that there's a real opportunity for inequality to be magnified.
Yes.
How do you tackle something like that, utilizing code?
Well, I think in the first place, we have to recognize that we will. It's a longed for dream that everybody will be equal, but it's not going to happen. What we have to be able to do is to be able to find the ways in which we could live together such that those in most need are themselves most looked after, and that there is a proportionate sharing of the wealth that is created to enable those that are, will slip off the sort of capitalist treadmill, as many would see it, or ladder, as others would see it. And that is a balance of proportionality, because the balance is so important. The reason why I say that is that at one level, if you overtax one grouping of people in order, you will kill the very thing that is going to enable a society to grow well. And that is where I sadly think that the political judgment of our generation, my generation, has not been as savvy, as compassionate as perhaps it might have been. And perhaps yours will make the big difference.
Yeah, I hope so. No pressure. But I've got a question for you that I'd love for you to answer twice, right? The same
Because
question.
I'll get it wrong the first time.
No. I want you to answer this question first to an audience of your generation,
Yes.
and then to an audience of mine.
Yeah.
Knowing everything that we know, and this immense wealth, and with it power and influence, that's going to impact the social fabric of our world. How is it that you would encourage, first your generation, to engage with Co? What are the practical steps that you would encourage for your generation to engage with Co? And then practically, how is it that you would convince mine?
Well, the first simple message was respect the generation. For my grouping of people, do not just dismiss them as a group of being utterly entitled and therefore, never learning the lessons, that the hard work, etc., of a previous generation. So I think that issue of respect is very, very important, because that governs everything else. That it governs whether you listen, that governs whether the insights that they have are treated seriously. To the next generation, you can't do it alone. There is no point in repeating the mistakes of the past. So actively go out to learn what it is that you can draw from a previous generation that will strengthen you in your generation to achieve what you really want to achieve, and collectively to be able to do something for humanity as a whole. And I think that is a combination of a generosity, both of spirit, giving time. If you're devoted to something, you give time, you give energy, and you give money. And if both groupings would say, okay, we're going to give our time, our energy, and our money, working together to avoid the sort of silos of this tribal conflict between the generations, then we will hopefully not have the clash of generations, but the cooperation of the generations.
Amazing. As we sort of draw slowly to a close, this has been a really insightful conversation for me.
Well, you've been asking sort of difficult questions, and as I haven't done my homework as well as I should have done, I hope the answers at least go some way towards creating the impression that it's your generation and mine that needs to work together.
Absolutely. What we tend to ask to close is the name of this show, being Loose Change, is whether you had any parting thoughts, which we call the loose change. But I wonder whether for yourself it could be anything. It could be what you'd like your legacy to be, or it could be something much sillier than that. But what would your parting thoughts of the loose change?
Parting thoughts would be, for your loose change, could you please buy this book, which is a little more than loose change, but hardcover, 20 quid. Maybe you'd have to earn something. So I would think with loose change,
buy the book. The $100 trillion wealth transfer. I was going to ask you, and not just to plug your book, if you'd sign a copy of this book for me.
I will certainly sign a copy of it. I think you've done all right in asking the questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you
very much.
It's been an absolute pleasure.